A holiday home is one of the most coveted gifts fate can give. You can imagine Odysseus leaving the walls of Troy for a fortnight home to Ithaca. This is a relatively new invention, a special encouragement to the individual by the machine of mass organization. It is an attempt, a rather lofty one, to make some adjustments to the plans of the god of war. One day the ticket to Ithaca was in my hands. Long-forgotten memories of the man I once was resurfaced in my mind. And of course, and above all, Penelope. I will rest under the olives. I will sit by the fireplace and reminisce. But here was Eric, asking about something that was never in Pandora's box. You can't get cigarettes in Germany. What am I going to smoke? Erich was a Berliner born near the Oranienburg Gate. Although these days you can only see them in old lithographs, the memory of them still lives on. Sergeant Fuchs once remarked sarcastically that our company would enter Berlin through them when the war was over. A few years later, the unemployed Erich would end his career as a watchman at a school in Zossen. Small in stature, cunning, witty, always with a funny story to tell, he probably seemed to the older pupils to be an expert in the shenanigans that are not taught at school. Excellent at chess. He had the facial expression of a schoolboy who studies the world around him with a fair amount of skepticism and is hard to surprise. I, the voice of the people, feel that he often liked to repeat such hackneyed clichés he always saved for important occasions. Erich hated any kind of sentimentality, and in this I was with him. He also hated boots, but on this point I could not agree with him. Instead of boots, he always wore dirty, tattered, open-toed shoes, and everyone called him Moccasin. When Erich heard that I was going on holiday, he gave me a small supply of cigarettes. Food was not good in Germany, and as a consequence I had to take some provisions with me on the road. Thus, the hero who was returning home dragged a goose 2,000 kilometers from the Caucasus to a small Tyrolean village. For this purpose, as Moccasin knew exactly, I must have a leather belt, with the help of which, when leaving Rostov, it would be necessary to hang this goose in the fresh air, so that it would not rot out in the hot heated carriage. It will be sprinkled with steam from the chimney from time to time, and gradually it will be covered with an icy crust. There were usually 40 to 50 frozen birds hanging on each side of the train going home. I said goodbye to Rombach. We didn't know if we would ever meet again. Stalingrad was surrounded, and a harsh Russian winter was coming. It was still autumn where our unit was, but we both knew how cold and sharp the wind gusts were. Naturally, I told him everything I had learnt from Major Fabricius. It was possible that we might both but no, for the hour of parting was near at hand. Perhaps he would end up here in a second Stalingrad while I rested in safety on the other side of Europe. On the other hand, I might come back just as this catastrophe was breaking out, and Rombach would be going home on holiday just at that time. The tacit agreement with the god of war represented a certain lottery. I had a strong feeling that I should not go. Our wonderful partnership would be disrupted. The absence of one of the surgeons during such significant events could not but affect the general course of affairs, and my leave would be paid for with human lives. Should I refuse my leave? However, there is an old rule among soldiers that one should never do anything unauthorized. Rombach and I never spoke on the subject. Each of us knew that he, like married couples living together for a long time. We thought alike. It took all his tact to ignore my doubts. Just one word from him would have been enough, and I probably would have stayed. Moccasin, with whom I had discussed the problem while shaving, just started laughing at me. With his usual sarcasm, he asked, "Do you want another medal? This time a very high honor? What about your madam? You can't do that to her." I set off on horseback for Mozdok early on the morning of the 21st of December. The journey home took 10 days, and finally, on the evening of the 31st, I reached the Tyrolean village with a goose hanging on my shoulder. It was so frozen that it was as strong as a stone. It was warm enough. We had guests assembled in our house, several handsome young airmen and some submariners. Very serious people had been invited to celebrate the new year. Penelope had invited some pretty girls to keep them company. The goose, which was greeted with a roar of approval, went into the oven, and Penelope's smiles melted the ice in my heart. It so happened that, though I was overexcited and could have recounted many adventures, I preferred not to speak of them. Could I describe the dangers I would face again in just a few days? Should I tell of the horrors of war in these still tranquil places? Should I tell of my own achievements and how they were recognized 2,000 years ago? Plotus mocked the bravado of veterans returning from war. My memories of what we fought so desperately for on those distant steppes are a jumble of everything. Imperial officials. The insignificance of those rude men who showed little compassion for the unfortunate prisoners of war. The forcible transfer of civilians from the east to an unknown but surely unenviable fate. The safety of those fortunate enough to serve in France, Norway, Denmark, or the Balkans, where they could sunbathe in peace. But at the end of the day, the Eastern Army still existed, and I was part of it. I did some notable and very useful work there. And my mates were there. What are they doing there now? I heard a rumour that 3 days after my departure, Rembach was struck by a severe attack of malaria and had to be sent to a hospital in Rostov. There was no doubt that I would return to my friends and my scalpel. No doubt at all. I went on holiday from the inevitable. That evening, Penelope had the good sense not to switch on the receiver and listen to the news bulletins from England. I wanted to spend the remaining few days of my holiday in Vienna, so Penelope could be with me one extra day. I sent a telegram to the Bristol Hotel to reserve a room for us, but I knew from past experience that at best our names would end up in the registration book. But when we got there, to our surprise, it turned out that the room was actually ready for us. And it had countless light bulbs and, even more strangely, they were all lit. The first miracle was followed by several others. I asked the porter if I could order some flowers. Of course, doctor. Just a moment, doctor. I'll send a travelling salesman. 10 minutes later, an exceptionally polite young man with a small, elegant black moustache, wearing thick leather-soled shoes, appeared. He could get absolutely anything, from whiskey and cigarettes to chrysanthemums and Swede shoes. Probably the porter had assured him that I was some mysterious but very important official. So all the things mentioned still existed. True, they had nothing to do with me. I smiled and worked out my options. On the last day of my holiday, I booked tickets for the Marriage of Figaro at the State Opera. I had already begun to look at such things from the point of view of how I would talk about them after my return to the Caucasus. I put on my tunic, multicoloured like a clown's clothes, as I put all my awards on it. I had already accumulated a whole collection of them during the 7 years I spent in the war. Penelope put on her evening dress made of black brocade with gold embroidery. Then we began to look at each other through the telescope. It was a real masquerade. Humming a little song, we went to the buffet. All the seats around us were occupied by imperial officials. There was something almost touching in their attempts to imitate the manners of the old world, which they pretended to despise. As soon as we were seated at a table and ordered our food, a news bulletin began to be broadcast. The hotel management tried to be very considerate to the guests. The loudspeaker was almost always switched off, but when a news bulletin was broadcast, it had to be switched on. There was a habit among the diners to stop all their conversations when the Wehrmacht communique was read out. I didn't know it. 1 or 2 men turned in my direction and looked at me angrily, but could do nothing when they saw my decorated tunic. So they sat like frozen phantoms and listened piously to the symbol fixed on the wall. The first thing was the news from Stalingrad. Everyone familiar with the terminology used in such communiques, it was clear that the end of the encircled group there was near. Most likely, the offensive undertaken to break the blockade had failed. But why didn't they break through on their own? Or had they already tried and failed? Then the news from the Teak began to be broadcast. I could hardly believe my ears. The Russians had launched an offensive there too. We began to retreat. The names of settlements were mentioned. They were familiar to me. Apparently, the Russian offensive had been going well for some time. I quickly calculated in my mind what distance could be covered in that time. Most likely, our company covered about 200 kilometers in 10 days. That is 20 kilometers a day. It was highly unlikely that horses could move at that speed in mud. The ground was probably frozen. Fabricius's words flashed through my mind. Then the party will lose this war. The phantoms came to life again, not even realizing that the curtain had just been raised before the last act of the drama began. They sat in this magnificent room, decorated with gilt and white marble, and ate the caviar that had been brought here from the Don. They hardly realized what the name of this river meant to them. They sat in the palace of Belshazzar, but they still could not see the fiery messages on the walls. Will it be possible, I thought, to stop the Russian advance on the Don? So the party will lose this war. In that stately room, such a thought filled me with a sense of gloating satisfaction. But what is really happening in the Caucasus? Penelope began to realize something. She looked at me questioningly. Suddenly I pictured her with a shawl thrown over her head, shaking in the back of a lorry during a snowstorm. I had seen many women in Russia like that, travelling somewhere on the only form of transport possible in a conquered country, towards something no one can define or describe. After all the atrocities committed, we could hardly expect anything better than to end our lives in some Siberian coal mine. So we went to see Les Nozze di Figaro. All we had to do was cross the street. It was snowing lightly. Penelope wore a scarf on her head. We took our seats in the box. We also took part in a pantomime, a 19th century pantomime. The elderly footman in knee-length pantaloons who showed us to our seats told me, when I asked him what he recalled at the sight of His Apostolic Majesty entering the imperial box. The orchestrators began to tune their instruments. There was a sense of celebration in the air. At this time I wondered if Garloff had abandoned the outdated ambulance wagons in the roadside ditch and harnessed the best horses to the other wagons, the ones pulling the operating theatre, the pharmacy, and perhaps the mobile forge. The latter was particularly difficult to haul because of its unwieldiness. The rhombus was missing. Such vital details were planned and discussed in every detail, throwing out the tents and loading blankets in their place. Apart from that, nothing was more important. Had he had a chance to consult Sergeant Hermann, he would have realized everything at once. Kinzel would rather shoot himself than throw away a single vial of ether. The old team. While I'm sitting here, they're probably riding into the night right now. The conductor raised his baton. Penelope smiled in a way that Calypso had never dreamed of. The violins played the overture. I thought of Tamara Mikhailovna, the beautiful girl from Krasnodar. Had she gone to the partisans? Does she shoot at ours? I thought about many other important events that happened in my life. It was a longing. The curtain rose, and we began to watch the most marvellous play of the 18th century with beautiful music. This is all true, of course. But we must not forget that it was a kind of prelude to the floods of blood and tears that were shed during the Great French Revolution. But did not this music survive the revolution? What will Europe be like when all our present difficulties have passed away? The great indomitable creator has silenced the inner voices. He forced the god of war once more into the shadows, but now for the last time. True harmony resembles deep, very deep breathing. The sextet, which played the final overture at the end of the piece, also played at the same time the final overture to my leave of absence, a leave of absence from the inevitable. The next morning I set off again for the Caucasus via Przemysl. It was spring again, but the wind that blew from the east had lost its familiar flavour. The Volga was far behind us. Its banks were strewn with the bones of thousands of brave soldiers, and the steppe had become a vast cemetery, which spring had strewn with bouquets of flowers. Our offensives were a thing of the past. The Germans were now mostly in retreat. Our division held the northernmost section of the Taman bridgehead, which partly consisted of marshy lakes at the mouth of a small river Gurka, which flowed into the Sea of Azov. At first, this section was not defended at all. But the Russians, as always unpredictable, suddenly attacked the opposite shore right through the swamp. Therefore, the infantry had to take defensive positions here. The soldiers lived practically in the water islands overgrown with reeds and willows. This section of the front remained relatively calm until the late autumn. The Russians tried to squeeze the Germans from the Taman bridgehead, having undertaken an offensive to the south. Our company opened a field surgical hospital 10 kilometers east of Temryuk, in a village called Sevenai Sadi. It was located near the road running along the shore of the estuary, not so far from the very road on which we travelled to Krasnodar, resembling from the outside a wandering gypsy tabor. The retreat from the Tiuk gave us a terrible shock. Our unit was able to retreat in an organised manner, but nevertheless the loss of materiel was quite considerable. Garloff actually abandoned 4 ambulance wagons, which I remembered just as the overture to the Marriage of Figaro was being played. They had harnessed 4 to 6 horses to the remaining wagons, and thus were able to successfully escape with all the necessary equipment and tools intact. The men mounted the untrained and abandoned horses they had managed to obtain, and only in this way was it possible to cover the enormous distances. The Russians, as they call it, were hanging on their tails. During the retreat, the combat units were constantly mixed up with non-combat units retreating to the rear, creating chaos and disorder, lacking sufficient firepower to engage in combat. They thought only of escape, although they usually lacked transport for an organised retreat. Our Supreme Commander no longer had the courage to look the harsh truth straight in the eye, and units in the rear received orders very late. On a number of occasions, when units had to retreat in haste without supplies of petrol, horse forage and food, they reached the next depot. But it turned out that there was an order not to issue anything, and this continued until the depot came under fire as the Russians were approaching. Only when it was already engulfed in flames were people allowed to snatch what they needed from the fire. One day, one unfortunate warehouse manager who, citing an order he had received, refused to allow anyone to enter the warehouse entrusted to him, was simply shot dead. It is quite strange how quickly such things were consigned to oblivion. After a while, the experienced soldier simply learnt to retreat faster. The second medical company of our division was located 2 kilometers closer to the front line than ours, in the village of Kurganskaya, and quite often found itself under fire. The Russian reconnaissance worked so effectively that at the end of each film show shown by the army forces, their field artillery would cover the place with several volleys, which always resulted in casualties. Eventually, a small Russian radio transmitter, which was used to correct the artillery strikes, was discovered in a house just outside the cinema. Rombach had returned from the hospital. In view of the circumstances, there was no need to work under fire, and the distance of 2 kilometers for the ambulance wagons did not present much of an obstacle, as the surface of the road was hard. We therefore did not insist on changing to another company, and they continued to receive the bulk of the wounded. Our company busied itself with other matters. The most vivid memory left in my mind from the summer spent on the Terman bridgehead is the dust. It covered the roads with a layer of many centimeters. All the wagons, all the riders, all the soldiers had to move in a thick cloud of dust. We were all constantly covered with dust. We constantly felt it in our mouths, and once we calculated that each of us ate almost a kilo of it in a month. Garloff reassured us by telling us that each horse needs to eat about the same amount of sand per month for its intestines to function properly. As we drove into Temryuk in the evenings, we often had to move among herds of cattle, each of which numbered up to several hundred animals. The dust raised by their hoofs was so dense that nothing could be seen ahead, and it was impossible to drive. The setting sun was emitting its last red rays, and out of the smoking clouds of dust, filled with the shouts of the drovers, the mooing of the animals, the barking of the dogs, suddenly appeared huge heads crowned with horns, passed right in front of our car, and then disappeared in the clouds of dust. But it wasn't just the dust that remained in my memory from that summer. In fact, my memories of it, and this is quite remarkable, are generally friendly and warm. It was only many years later that I realized to what extent we mislead ourselves by so-called general considerations. We believe that we ourselves have behaved decently, but the Russians have not. None of their many attacks against the Taman bridgehead succeeded, and their losses were simply appalling. As for the party, not one of its representatives appeared on that accursed peninsula. In our close circle, we were still able to talk about what we thought without fear. To some extent, we lived outside the ideological attitudes prevailing in the Reich. When I met Fabricius again a few weeks later, he greeted me with these words. "So, my friend, what are they talking about in the highest circles in Vienna? They're all defeatists. I know that for a fact. What's the latest on Vinny?" In fact, Churchill, the living embodiment of the British lion, was very popular with us. We invented a sandwich that consisted of layers of Gruyere cheese, smoked sturgeon, and caviar, and we called it Winston Churchill. One day, a young officer who had been in the intelligence service came to see me to consult an old doctor about a problem that had begun to trouble him with the onset of winter. He held some responsible position in the Hitler Youth, and I knew that he was trying to prove himself by all means. There were many people of this type in the army, and almost all of them were excellent soldiers. I had no choice but to lay down stubborn facts against his touching, but dangerous idealism. And as this meant a complete collapse of his former ideas of the world, it might lead to a very serious moral and mental crisis. Convinced that I was a traitor to their cause, he could easily have reported me to the authorities. But nothing like that happened. He reconsidered our conversation and came to me one day, asking me directly why I continued to serve in the army. He was full of the uncompromising determination that is as much an attractive as it is a lightweight property of youth. And really, why do I still continue to serve? Age, difficult years of service in Russia. So even under the current regulations, at any time I could demand to be transferred to one of the hospitals within Germany itself. So why didn't I do it? As a rule, Our actions are dictated not by a single reason, but by a whole complex of reasons, which can easily include the most diverse motives. The first reason I had can be summarized in the words of Talleyrand, who served as French foreign minister under various regimes. He once said, "Above all things is honour." My second reason was more specific. I liked to experience that sense of danger that comes from enemy artillery fire. The third reason I had was purely exploratory, a kind of craving for scientific observation. The same craving that drives meteorologists to the snowstorms of the Himalayas, geologists to the boiling vent of a volcano, and ethnologists to the skull hunters living in the upper reaches of the Amazon. There must be eyewitnesses who can then tell us exactly what really happened here. The real specialists, us surgeons, began to gradually leave the surgical field hospitals. Their places were taken by the next generation. These were doctors who had learnt their skills here. No one has the right to condemn the surgical aces for the fact that they sought transfer to a more prestigious job, because from a purely professional point of view, work in a surgical field hospital is quite monotonous, and it was necessary to develop entire branches of surgery, which otherwise could be simply lost. And back in the rear hospitals, they worked real miracles, helping the wounded to get back on their feet. But saving a wounded man's life depended first of all on the surgeon to whom he got there in the first place. Neither I nor Rombach could betray our company, which over the years had developed into a well-coordinated and efficient team. We concentrated our efforts on the fight against malaria, and not only the troops but also the civilian population was involved. Examination of a large group of patients revealed that an enlarged spleen was one of the symptoms of chronic malaria in a large part of the Russian population. Children looked particularly pale, miserable little creatures with swollen bellies and legs that resembled matchsticks. The troops provided food for the few Russians who remained in the village, so we had good relations with the local population. However, it was not easy to persuade them to take anti-malarial pills, after which the skin takes on a yellowish tinge after a while. We had to make a complete list of the local population in order to monitor their health. This census greatly alarmed the people, and we had to work hard to convince them that we had no ill intentions. An order was issued for compulsory treatment of everyone living in the area. Plasmodium leveranum, the microorganism that causes malaria, does not know who is a winner and who is a loser. The high incidence of malaria among the troops could only be reduced if the civilian population was also treated. At the same time, we conducted a campaign to eradicate malaria mosquitoes, which transmit Plasmodium malaria from one person to another. Studies showed that only one mosquito in 10,000 was infected. But even that number of mosquitoes was enough to bring the number of cases to epidemic levels. Among the 500 civilians examined, we found 23 new cases of malaria and, to our horror, no less than 11 cases of typhoid fever. Typhus is transmitted by lice, and we found them constantly on our bodies. In summer, this scourge is not so common as in winter, so consequently the danger of spreading typhus is not so great, though it always exists. We set up a special camp for civilians with typhus in a remote location, but nevertheless several doctors and orderlies did contract typhus. The mortality rate among typhoid patients was extremely high. Our prevention campaign had some success. We took the trouble to explain to our people in detail the dangers of malaria and the preventive measures necessary in such cases. This explanatory work was met with great enthusiasm, with particular enthusiasm for the Latin terms, which many people learnt by heart. Children from the villages of Severny Sadi, Golubitskaya and Starotitarovskaya, who were then 5 and now 15 years old, may still remember the people who gave them chocolates to break the bitterness and persuade them to swallow the bitter-tasting yellow tablets. The reward was the sense of satisfaction we gained from a peaceful campaign against mosquitoes and lice, conducted in the thick of the deadly carnage that was going on all around us. There were also other activities by which, with some ingenuity, we continued our service under the invisible flag. The main line of defence which our division held in the swampy delta of the Gurkha River on the Taman bridgehead was held mainly by water rather than land. The soldiers who lived on islands covered with reeds and willow thickets suffered mercilessly from mosquitoes, midges, flies and lice. The inevitable scratching of the skin led to the penetration of various infections. We have seen almost unbelievable cases of people whose skin was a blister and who were still standing on their feet. The patients didn't come to us at the beginning when they first started having these problems. They were courageous fighters who never complained about the pain until they couldn't stand it anymore. but by then their skin had usually got into such a terrible state that they had to be sent to rear hospitals, even though they tried to avoid it. They knew from experience that they would not be better off anywhere than in their own unit. Their service was valued here, and they knew that they could rely on their neighbour and that he knew his duties thoroughly. The officers who commanded them had for years shared with them all the hardships of service, and together they had been through more than one campaign. These old soldiers were the backbone of the army. They were experienced fighters, unpretentious, had a wonderful sense of humour. At that time there was a story going around among them, and it must be said that they were characterized by an ironic perception of reality. They imagined a triumphant parade under the Brandenburg Gate after a victory had been won. In front, a line of field marshals marched in solemn step. Behind them followed the Lord of the World, covered with gold. Behind him, on a moving platform, a huge knight's iron cross with laurels was fixed. Behind him moved an endless stream of some other cartoon characters, whom I have already forgotten. At the very end appeared a very old corporal with an enormously long beard, covered with awards, a gas mask, a sapper spatula, a camp cauldron, hand grenades and a rifle. When asked what he was doing here, he would reply in a strange mixture of German and Russian words. Nicht understand. He had been in Russia so long that he had forgotten German. Do you understand? It is well known that a fisherman from the Frisian Islands and a wine grower from Styria can understand each other better if they explain themselves in Russian. Once, for example, there was a case when we had a peasant from Styria, a tall black-haired guy with incredible physical strength, on the operating table. He had been given the usual dose of ether for ordinary wounds, and 4 orderlies had hardly managed to hold him down. They, of course, could not help making caustic comments about his manhood. When the Styrian had recovered from the effects of the anesthesia, and it gradually dawned on him that he was being joked at by some Prussians, he raised himself up on the operating table, looked unkindly at each of us in turn, and then said in a somewhat unusual accent, "We Austrians hate your stinking Prussian entrails," and then added in Russian, "Understand?" We understood everything. We had to think of something for the patients coming from the marshy Lake district. The old soldiers were in complete agreement with their general's decision that they should stay together. The general, intelligent, educated, reserved, sarcastic, well-mannered, generous E, was always either in the trenches or surveying positions in the marshy thickets, something like an old-fashioned English colonial officer. He had been wounded in the First World War, and as a result of this injury had a slight limp. As he sauntered along the front line with his steel helmet on his head, one foot slightly hobbled, he looked like a respectable and gallant gentleman. He was a bachelor and wore a gold bracelet on his left hand, which evidently meant a great deal to him. One day he asked me, it was just a few days before he was killed, that he should be buried with this piece of jewellery. He was not really popular with the troops. He was too lonely and reserved for that. But among the soldiers he was highly respected. The general liked very much our idea of bringing soldiers who had contracted malaria back to their units, and of treating their skin wounds in a hospital in the immediate vicinity of the bridgehead, which should be under the command of the division command. In this way, experienced soldiers would again be returned to their units. We opened a hospital for the lightly wounded in the village of Golubitskaya, located on the shore of the Sea of Azov, just a few kilometres west of Temryu. It was a very picturesque fishing village at the foot of the cliff, reminiscent of the small villages characteristic of the Baltic coast. The houses, sheltered in the shade of acacia trees, were scattered quite freely, under the influence of the sun's rays, and the fresh breeze the bog sores healed very quickly. This proved to be a very useful innovation, and we pampered the soldiers as best we could. There was a fish canning factory in Temryuk, and one day I met a man in a black hat with an umbrella in his hands and galoshes on his feet. He had just arrived from Hamburg. I greeted him politely, and he lifted his hat in return. As it turned out, he was the manager of this factory. He asked me what I was doing here. When I told him that here we treat the wounded from the swamp area, he immediately offered to supply us with fresh caviar. Thus, every day a barrel with a capacity of up to 5 kilograms of caviar of the highest grade was sent by a special plane to the Air Force headquarters, and another barrel of the same type was delivered on a peasant's cart to the old soldiers who fell ill in the swamps. We spread caviar in thick layers on black army bread. One day we heard a complaint from one of our heroes that he didn't like salty marmalade. We started spreading plum jam on his bread. We transported all our horses and all our luggage to Golubitskaya, and now every day the riders drove the horses to bathe in the shallow water. The beach was flat, covered with hard white sand. It was pleasant to look at the bronze-tanned people sitting on their horses and jumping from them directly into the sea. Once a Russian fighter jet flew over us and fired several bursts of machine gun fire. Although it is much safer from a medical point of view if a bullet hits the naked body rather than through clothing, the dirty scraps of which litter the wound, it turned out that a naked man feels much more helpless in such a situation than when he is dressed in a military uniform. The soldiers liked to amuse themselves by saluting each other with quite a serious look when in the nude. However, we interrupted this comedy by forbidding them to salute on the beach, and gradually the peaceful, quiet rhythm of life settled down. In addition to the fight against malaria, our efforts were directed to the fight against lice, for which we had to build showers and to hold training courses for the medics, who trained on the wounded who were constantly coming to us, because every night an aeroplane flew over the road next to us, throwing bombs indiscriminately. We also put on shows in an open-air theatre built on a hillside on the outskirts of Temryuk, fought the ulcers that plagued the horses, and prepared for possible chemical warfare. From time to time, we were able to send a few men home on leave. Sergeant Herman was able to bring several quintals of coffee with him during the retreat from the Caucasus, and we gave everyone going home a certain amount of coffee. The ulcers from which the horses suffered gave us almost as much trouble as the soldiers' sores. We built narrow boxes in which the horses stood so that they could only stick their heads out through holes in the wall, and these holes were covered with rubber. We smeared their bodies with sulphur. This method of treatment proved quite reassuring. Them could never discount the possibility that chemical warfare might break out, and then a real catastrophe could occur. Some poisonous gases that could be sprayed on enemy positions from the air were life-threatening, even if they simply got on clothing. Soldiers in marching columns who might be the target of such an attack would have to shed their uniforms. Such gases can be neutralized with some chemicals, but a significant concentration of them in the material would be life-threatening. We started training decontamination platoons, but instead of real equipment, we had only mileages at our disposal. If chemical warfare starts for real, we will be completely helpless, at least from the moment the enemy gains air superiority. Why one of the most effective means of defeat was never used during the war is still a mystery to me. The monotony of existence was one of the downsides of war. It was what filled the time between important dramatic events. During such peaceful respites, a soldier is busy repairing his personal combat weapons, improving his fighting skills, thinking about and preparing for his future, making himself as comfortable as possible, in a way resembling an ant that carries everything in reserve. We used to visit each other. By chance, the pontooners arrived in our neighborhood, and on this occasion the personnel of the company were having a holiday because Colonel Reinhardt had been promoted to the rank of general and had been appointed commander of the fortification in Dnipropetrovsk. He sent us beer for the occasion. We cooked fresh sausages and sausages ourselves. We invited the division commander to visit us, and he made us a pleasant surprise by bringing with him awards for the personnel. Offensive actions, which the Russians took on the opposite shore of the Sea of Azov, clearly showed that we will not be able to hold the Taman bridgehead indefinitely. Fabricius called October the decisive month, and as it turned out later, he was right. We decided to build a bomb shelter especially for the operating theatre, and gradually it turned into a small hospital hidden underground. Two problems arose in connection with this project: where to get the necessary building materials and labor. It was completely impossible to get the materials in the usual, official way. They could only be obtained on the black market, exchanging them for petrol, coffee, vodka. Only in this way we could get everything we needed, and this time our old friend Stubb gave us invaluable help. He was promoted to the rank of major, and now his unit was located in the village of Starotitarovskaya. Accompanied by him, we went to the warehouse of one of the engineer units, with one of the officers of which he was acquainted, while we were busy chasing the warm south wind. As Sergeant Herman called such meetings, he personally arranged with the all-powerful senior sergeant in charge of the warehouse. We got everything we wanted, including cement and steel plates, and Major Stubb had them delivered to us on his tractors. We were sorely lacking in bricks only, and it so happened that in the village of Severnaya Sadi we were stationed very near a large brick building. For many kilometers around this was probably the only little or no suitable target for a bomber. It was obvious that in case of our retreat, the Russian Air Force would heavily bomb this area. We decided to dismantle this building into bricks and thus use the material from the abandoned building for the benefit of the wounded. There were several experienced builders in our company. They were able to select the right number of bricks so that the building did not even collapse. We covered the empty window peepholes with sheets of plywood so that no trace of damage was visible from the road. One day the general, who, as it happened, knew nothing of our request to dismantle part of the building, for bricks, rode past it on horseback and suddenly noticed the traces of our work. He laughed and sent a second-class Distinguished Service Cross for the man who had thought of doing it. 3 weeks later, during an air raid, the Russians blew the building to pieces. Much more difficult was finding the necessary labor force. During such relatively quiet periods, men from the local population were brought in to do various jobs. But we have been able to overcome this difficulty. A fortnight ago, we had a visit from Major Feldman, the battalion commander. During the siege of Sevastopol, he had commanded an operation in which the fortress defences were breached at a key point. He told us that he had been given leave tickets even more than the number of men he could safely release without fear of exposing his defences. We discussed this problem with him. We ordered the sergeants to ask our men if any of them would agree to volunteer to join Feldman's battalion for a while, so that as many of his men as possible could go home on leave. The attitude of our command towards the matter was very characteristic. The soldiers said that they did not mind transferring to another battalion for a while, but they did not want to write a report that they were doing it voluntarily, but wanted to be ordered to do so. The Chief of Medical Services of the division, who was sent to us not long ago, was a sensible, intelligent man. Besides being a great connoisseur of claret, and as he had been in medical practice between the 2 world wars, not badly versed in medicine, he readily acceded to our request and ordered that the men be replaced in the manner we had suggested. When Major Feldman came to visit us 2 weeks later, we told him of the difficulties we had encountered in finding labour. 3 days later, with the first rays of sunshine, a sergeant from his battalion arrived at our best wishes from Major Feldman. He has sent you 20 Russians to build a bomb shelter. Feldman sent us prisoners of war. Without reporting it officially, he just sent them to us. Not only did we have no opportunity to guard the prisoners, but we did not even want to do so. We simply tried to win their sympathy. I must say, only one of them subsequently escaped. All the others remained to serve in the company. After a while, turned into voluntary helpers and began to wear German uniforms. One day we were approached by a senior sergeant from our company who had a letter from the widow of a man who had died in our hospital. He had been wounded in the abdomen at 3 a.m. and was brought to us an hour later. I performed an operation on him, but he could not be saved. He died 3 days later. We sent his widow all his personal effects. Now his widow wrote that she had received a letter from her husband, which he had sent to her the evening before he died. In this letter he wrote to her that he was going to send her 400 marks, which he had managed to save, the next day. However, this money never reached her, and among the personal items we sent her there were only 20 marks. It was quite impossible that this money could have been stolen. This kind of thing simply never happened in our company. The ambulance driver who delivered the wounded soldier served in our company just about the longest. The orderly who tended to the wounded man was Sergeant Herman. Sergeant Kinzel was in charge of sending personal effects. We asked Major Feldman for help, as the wounded man was from his battalion. The major investigated and found out that the soldier had actually written the letter and handed it to the postman. He then gambled the 400 marks at cards, then went on guard duty, where he was wounded. Those soldiers who played cards with him, he made him return the money, and it was sent to the widow. When the summer was over, it became noticeably colder during the day. The activity of the enemy increased. This was a sure sign that the Russians were up to something. Major Fabricius went home on leave. The division command post was only a few kilometers away, on the other side of the hill. From the headquarters we had a wide view of the thickets of reeds near the Kuban. The river was home to an inconceivable number of birds, ruled by several majestic swans. Fabricius came to us early in the morning to say goodbye, and we settled down on the small terrace in front of our hut. 2 old friends who had much to discuss. During the summer it became more and more evident that the party had lost the war. But at that time we had not yet given much thought to what would happen to us personally. Fabricius explained to me that the strategically important events which had taken place that summer in Russia were the inevitable consequence of the mistakes made in 1941 and 1942. The new mistakes that the dictator was making time after time could only be explained by the fact that he himself believed in the myth of his strategic genius. Just in front of us was the division cemetery. Behind it, the sun was reflected in the smoothness of the Kurgan estuary, inhabited by an enormous number of birds. We calculated whether we should withdraw our unit. However, it was impossible. What happened to us if the old steppe foxes, who know the ins and outs of war, withdrew to the rear and left the front to be defended by new recruits who still had to learn everything? Didn't we want to win? The Japanese in Karachi? We both laughed. They didn't even dare to attack India. Yet they've taken over the whole of Eastern Asia. Like rats in a trap. China is bigger than Russia. Bigger than Russia. Moccasin, who was a consummate master in the art of making Turkish coffee, made a magnanimous gesture. Then Sergeant Herman appeared, saluted carelessly, took a piece of paper out of his pocket, and with an air of importance announced the promotion of Major Fabricius to the rank of honourable private in the medical service. He handed him half a kilo of coffee, which was now at his disposal. Fabricius laughed and thanked him. Then he got into the car and, waving goodbye, disappeared in a huge cloud of dust. The peaceful summer disappeared in the same cloud. 3 days later we buried the general. He died on the way to the fighting positions. His car hit a mine and the explosion blew it to pieces. We buried him among the soldiers in the cemetery on the bank of the Kurgan estuary. The funeral was held with all military honours in the presence of the army commander. The whole ceremony was covered by a squadron of fighter planes from above. After a few weeks, there was not a single cross left on the graves. Finally, the day X came. Since about the end of summer, it became more and more obvious that the Taman bridgehead would have to be evacuated. The whole operation was thought out down to the smallest detail, and it was carried out in accordance with the plan. The situation was by no means simple. The Russians had concentrated considerable forces to attack our positions, and we were probably only a few days ahead of them. It was clear that they would do everything possible to inflict as much damage on us as possible. Their plans had been thwarted. This evacuation can be considered a model of operational art developed by the General Staff. Apparently, its example is still used every year at the Franz Academy in Moscow to tell young Russian staff officers how to conduct such operations. In the last days before the evacuation, we were not only heavily bombed from the air, but also shelled from artillery guns. The Russians had introduced a battery of new long-range guns of 8 to 8 centimeter caliber, mounted in willow thickets in the swamps, from where they could easily reach us. However, the shelters we had erected during the summer saved us from unnecessary losses, and we were now doing operations underground. We even had running water, which came from a concrete tank located on the roof of the bunker. On the day of X2, we handed over this bunker to another medical company, which could no longer stay in the village of Kurganskaya because it had been bombed very heavily, and their genuine amazement at what they saw compensated us for all the suffering of parting with our brainchild. We opened a field surgical hospital in Golyubitskaya, west of Temryuk. Our hospital for the lightly wounded had been disbanded some time before, and all medical equipment had been sent to the Crimea. The company formed 2 independent field surgical teams, which were very mobile and supplied with only the essentials. Our second surgeon was included in one of them, and the young military medic in the other. I was called in wherever most needed. Both groups had lorries and ambulances at their disposal, but just in case, as it could rain any day. We kept a few peasant carts. It was all improvisation, but it was improvisation based on our vast practical experience. During the night we reached Golubitskaya, and at dawn the next day we bathed for the last time in the waves of the surf. I had breakfast with Rombach. We both knew that day she was appointed for tomorrow and waited for the return of Sambo. He had to deliver the latest orders of the division commander. He arrived a short time later, accompanied by Hermann, now a senior sergeant, and Corporal Schwarzbach, who had taken Sergeant Klein's place as Chief of Chancellery. Klein was placed under the direct command of the division medical chief. We were very sorry to part with him. He was a consummate master of military bureaucracy, but to have a close friend serving in the chancellery of our immediate superior was a great advantage. Hermann and Schwarzbach looked very picturesque as they tried to drive an old rusty motorbike across the sand. We had no idea what fly had bitten our superiors and just had to follow orders. The fact was that just that morning we had received an order to increase the mobility of medical companies equipped with horse-drawn vehicles. And this after 2 years' experience of warfare in Russia. According to the new order, The company sergeant major and the chief of staff were to have a motorbike each at their disposal. In fact, the company sergeant major not only had a motorbike at his disposal, but also a horse. Otherwise, he simply could not cope with his many duties. On the front line on day X, everything went according to plan. But in our section, there was one unforeseen circumstance. The Russians had landed a landing at night on a stretch of coast between our village and Temryuk, only a few kilometers from us. Apparently, they were going to blow up the bridge across the Kuban. The ships that had landed the landing party melted away in the pre-dawn fog, and those who had landed took up a circular defense around one of the farms. For some time they kept quiet. Everyone took the incident rather lightly, as they had practiced a similar situation during the exercise 2 weeks earlier. So we gave the command that later became famous. Alarm the three, you know what to do. Alarm groups armed with machine guns took up positions in shallow trenches on the eastern edge of the village. They had been dug during the exercise, but had crumbled since then. We only missed our medical chief from the corps headquarters, who was watching our actions, harping on his horse and recording them with a stopwatch. Meanwhile, the field surgical team operating in the village was successful in its task, as there were only a few lightly wounded. It took it only 22 minutes. The second group was moved to another part of the village, which was located on a steep slope overlooking the road. They managed to sneak unnoticed along the flooded road and then returned the same way, and they had succeeded in their task. With a serious expression on his face, the company's senior sergeant stated that he thought he should be treated to a coffee for such a successful maneuver. What do you think? Rombach asked. We cannot offend him by refusing. So we poured some from Herman's flask, which was usually filled with vodka, contrary to all regulations. These seemingly insignificant, absurd trifles are symptoms of an inner restlessness, a constant sense of fear. Was the situation actually dangerous or, rather, ridiculous? We had to find out. In the meantime, it was getting light, and we began to look round the area with binoculars. But we could see nothing but lone figures here and there, and most of the time it was not clear whether they were ours or the enemy's. As usual, Rombach and I thought alike, without exchanging a single word. The core of the company was made up of experienced fighters, and I myself, though many years ago, was not the last infantry lieutenant. A decisive, rapid attack on the Russian positions, supported by the fire of 2 machine guns, was to ensure our success. Military medics should only take up arms when absolutely necessary, but this time there was just such an occasion. There was glory ahead of us. All we had to do was to get it. We looked at each other. Should we? Several bullets whizzed by us. Now it was too late to retreat, and that's when Sambo arrived. But Sambo immediately realized what was going on. He didn't deliver any message. Instead, he took some hand grenades out of a bag hanging on the left side of his motorbike, where he usually carried his chickens. He grinned. We need to smoke those Russians out of there. Mercendine Sambo, what's going on? The assistant chief of medicine wants to know if the second field surgical team can come forward. They've already got 40 wounded. All right. Now it's clear what's going on. With a sense of slight regret, the infantry lieutenant who had taken part in the Battle of the Somme said goodbye to his chance for some glory. On a viscous, flooded road, I rode into the village on the back of Sambo's motorbike. By this time there were no longer 40 but 60 wounded, as 20 Russians had been added. I patted Sambo on the shoulder. You old rascal, they are wounded too, aren't they? Sambo had the look of a seasoned soldier who has been given a well-deserved reprimand, and he himself knows it. Half an hour later he brought a Russian woman in uniform with him into the operating theatre. She was sitting by the roadside with the other Russian prisoners, and as she was a doctor he at once separated her from the others. She was badly frightened, but within 10 minutes she was bandaging one of the Russians who was not very seriously wounded. Every day the front line moved, 2 kilometers to the west. The Russians never once succeeded in forcing our troops to retreat in disorder, and gradually this began to cause our soldiers a sense of legitimate pride. When I went to see Fabricius one day, he showed me some Russian radio intercepts. They were sent unencumbered from the commander of the 56th Army to the commander of the 414th Infantry Division. How could you advance 12 kilometers without taking a single trophy? From the commander of the 414 Infantry Division to the commander of the 56th Army. How could I capture trophies if the Germans take everything of value with them? The word trophies in the radio intercept was in German. Our difficulties increased as the evacuation gained momentum. The more German units left the bridgehead, the more tangible the Russian superiority became. The Taman Peninsula has two protrusions that stretch in a westerly direction, not reaching only a few kilometers to the Kerch Peninsula. Every effort was made to persuade the Russians that we intended to use the southern ledge to complete the evacuation. But in fact, the evacuation was carried out from the northern ledge. The Russians were misled. They threw a considerable force on the south ledge and found no one there. And by the time they were able to regroup, the evacuation of the northern bulge was already over. At the point where these two ledges meet, our field surgical hospital was located for the last few days. Chief of Medical Service of the Army Group remained with us until the very end. In a letter home, he reported the date of the day X, so the front commander and sent him here as a disciplinary action. His successor had already arrived in the Crimea, but no one could order the Lieutenant General to leave his post in such a critical situation, especially since his successor was not at his combat post. That one never made it to the Cuban? In fact, this very honourable man had no other choice. There were only a few units left on this side of the strait, so he voluntarily stayed with us and worked in the field surgical hospital as an ordinary doctor. Naturally, we gratefully accepted the help he offered, but in fact his usefulness was quite different. Using his connections, he managed to get a light aircraft Storch at our disposal, and now we had the opportunity to evacuate patients with abdominal wounds to the Crimea immediately after surgery. Such a means of transport caused them minimum inconvenience. In the same way we could evacuate patients with head wounds. Sometimes craniocerebral operations could not be performed immediately, but if a wounded person had already undergone such an operation, it was strictly forbidden to transport him for some time afterwards. The pilots who flew these storms were great guys. In order not to be shot down by Russian fighters on their way to us, they flew along poplar tree plantings, right over the ground, showing marvelous flying skills. They continued to fly towards us, even when the field near the village, where they were landing, was already under fire from Russian artillery. This was the only case in all the years of the war when we did not lose a single patient because of shortcomings in the organization of the removal of the wounded. At last they were given all the comforts they deserved. At last the surgeons were given an opportunity to show what they could do, working under tolerable conditions and using modern methods of treatment. All this we owe to our Lieutenant General. We moved to the other side of the strait on the evening of the very last night of the stay of our troops in the Kuban. The mobile detachment of our company remained there until the last units left Taman. With the accuracy of a minute, these units arrived at the landing places, where speedboats were waiting to take them to the Kerch Peninsula. 2 sappers were assigned to each berth, who were to mine them before the ships went to sea. The last squad arrived at one of these berths at 3 o'clock and 10 minutes in the morning. They were picked up by a speedboat and began to head out to sea towards the other shore. Everything went like a stopwatch, but then it turned out that 2 sappers had disappeared. Eventually they were found. It turned out they had just fallen asleep under the jetty. At noon we were already on the road running along the seashore towards Kerch. An officer from our company's mobile detachment joined Rombach, who was accompanied by Sergeant Vertruber. Rombach's driver switched on the radio in his superior's car, and the whole company gathered round it. The Taman Peninsula was visible on the opposite side of the strait. The radio began to transmit another Wehrmacht communique. Today, at dawn, with proudly raised head, the last German soldier left the Taman bridgehead. Captain Rombach, said Vertruber. It was probably a soldier from the resupply. We all crawled away on our own bellies. Just like that, this grand success of our army was crowned by the laughter of our whole company. So we were in the Crimea again. Another autumn in the steppe, where the east wind was relentlessly driving the perekatipol bushes from one horizon line to another. Again they were passing before us. The last time our division had been here, everyone had grown accustomed. We were now commanded by a new general, and we were happy again. He always listened to the requests of the medics and did his best to provide the wounded with everything they needed. At the same time, a new medical chief arrived in our division, the 12th since I had been in it myself. I've never been able to understand what was the point of the policy of constantly shaking people up. I can only say one thing, it was wrong. This colonel had never been in Russia before, so we were dreadfully expecting a series of orders which would clearly demonstrate the extent of his incompetence. During the last two winter campaigns, many deficiencies in the system of evacuation of the wounded had become apparent, and the transport capacity of the units engaged in their evacuation was still far from being adequate. In Simferopol, there were new six-wheeled ambulances, which could only drive on very good roads. They delivered the wounded on the paved streets of the city from the main hospital to the railway station, while the ancient, cramped cars of Lieutenant Joachim easily overcome any mud. Some of them had already travelled hundreds of thousands of kilometres of roads covered with dust, mud and snow. Major Stubb was somewhere on the big earth. I never saw him again, and I don't even know if he is alive. If, in spite of everything, we were still able to overcome most of the difficulties that arose before us, we owe it only to the help of Major Fabricius. Each time we sent Sambo to him, who drew a cigar from a box which became famous throughout the division, and the Major gave us as many vehicles to carry our equipment as we asked for. We were stationed in a village in the steppes of the northern part of the Crimea, inhabited by Bulgarians. In 1878, Tsar Alexander erected the Bulgarians from the power of the Turks and then invited the ancestors of these people to settle here. They cleared this land and began to cultivate it. The village was surrounded by huge fields of sunflowers and corn, and herds of animals grazed peacefully in the steppe. We lived in the house of the headman. He was a tall man of sturdy build, with a long black beard, which gave him a resemblance to the images of saints on medieval miniatures. We treated him with great respect, as did all the villagers, and he, in turn, also treated us very well, for on the very day we arrived in the village we had assured him that we would not engage in robbery. As he later told us, he didn't really believe us at the time, but we kept our word. Our own experience showed that if we treated the peasants well, paid them for eggs and chickens, or simply exchanged them for things they needed, the food we needed was always available. Moreover, we made friends with the peasants and often provided them with our own horses during harvest time. Most of our riders were peasants themselves, and the concerns of the local people were close to them, which helped to establish friendly relations between them. One day a headman came to us and asked permission for him and the headmen of several neighbouring villages to listen to news from Sofia on our radio. The commander immediately gave this permission, and now every afternoon the benighted old men would gather in the living room of the headman's house, where I and Rumbach lived. We always went away, leaving the peasants alone, and after the news had been broadcast the headman usually invited us to drink a glass of homemade wine with them. One day I went into the room while listening to the news to get my belt. I don't know a word of Bulgarian, but several times I heard the phrase Red Army. I called for Sergeant Votruba. It turned out that the peasants were listening to the Moscow radio. For playing such a joke on us, we decided to teach them a lesson. The three of us burst into the room, waving our revolvers, and "Mabiuims, up." Quite frightened, the peasants raised their hands. Only the headman remained unperturbed. He calmly walked over to the radio, switched it off, then turned to Rombach with a smile and said, "Mr. Commander, what should we do? We are in danger. We have wives and children. Goodbye, I'm sorry." All this he said with the dignity of a free man addressing other free men, though of course none of us were really free. Still, nothing could express the confidence of these peasants in ordinary German soldiers more clearly than the fact that they did not take our threats, backed by revolvers, seriously. A little ashamed, we stuffed our revolvers back into our trouser pockets. In the evening the headman came to us to ask for advice. He knew from a Moscow radio report that the Crimea would soon be occupied by the Russians. The peasants expected nothing but endless trouble from the Soviets, for there were certain to be informers among them who would report to the NKVD the good relations they had maintained with the German troops. Although they were not kulaks in the Soviet sense of the word, they were not part of the collective farm either, and the headman was convinced that they would all be sent to Siberia. So he asked us to find out whether the Germans would be able to hold Crimea, or if they would have to move the whole village to the land of their ancestors, to Bulgaria. The question was more than insidious. There was no doubt that Crimea could not be held for a long time, but army officers could not just go and tell some headman's secrets that they could not tell even to their soldiers. But after all, we weren't mere army officers after all. Could we deceive this honourable and honest man who had put his trust in us? While Rumbach and I were discussing this question, the headman's wife brought a bottle of wine. The headman poured it into glasses, raised his own and drained it in one gulp, in accordance with Bulgarian custom. Ancient customs have to be observed, so we followed his example. Then he looked at us attentively, his hands resting on his knees, and from time to time he scratched his grey beard. He had the wisdom common to all elderly peasants. He realized what we were discussing. In any case, they had to leave. We told him that no one could foresee all the twists and turns of the war. If the Russians could be stopped at the straight line, the villagers could go back at any moment. If the Russians came here, they had better leave for good. The headman shook hands with us. The next 3 days the peasants devoted to preparations for departure, and at that time the front line, which ran along the northern shore of the Sea of Azov, began to roll back gradually to the west. The peasants attached new rims to the wheels of their carts. They slaughtered sheep, boiled the meat and salted it in large vats. They baked bread in brick ovens in the courtyard. Everything they did was quite reasonable and well thought out, and it was all done in a calm and concentrated manner. It seemed as if they were acting according to some long-established plan. Several generations ago, their ancestors had come to this land that had been given to them, and now they were preparing to leave it. They retained their dignity. The company allocated several carbines to the headman because, without weapons, the peasants were defenseless against the wolves. The general was a sensible man, and he favoured our request to grant them a permit. At dawn the next day, the horses were harnessed to the carts, and the cattle driven outside from the barns. At the first rays of the sun, the whole family of the headman assembled. The eldest son picked up the icon that his great-grandfather had brought back from Bulgaria. Until today it had protected them all. The whole family began to pray, kneeling down. The headman recited the Lord's Prayer in his old courtyard in farewell. He fell to his knees next to the oven in which they had baked bread every day for years, bowed his bearded face and kissed the earth that he had watered with sweat all his life. The earth that had given them abundance in gratitude for their labour kissed the icon. Then he rose to his feet, came towards us, embraced us, kissed each of us in a fatherly way, and then called God's blessing upon us. The succession of carts started travelling. Slowly the bulky carts pulled out of the gate. Cows and sheep followed behind, surrounded by barking dogs. In the wide village street, other peasants began to join the procession, driving their cattle into the steppe. Up until noon, we could see a cloud of dust that gradually disappeared over the horizon. Homeless and persecuted, these people wandered the land as their distant ancestors had done in time immemorial. A few days later, when I was sent outside the unit on a reconnaissance mission, I came across these displaced people again. The peasants were travelling along the road in carts in a strict order, and the headman greeted me like an old friend. We gave him all the tobacco we had with us. The peasants crossed the Perekop Isthmus, but they never reached the Dnieper. The advanced Russian units caught up with them in the Nogai steppe, and they scattered in all directions. Their hopes for a bright future were never realized. Hardly any of them would be able to return to their former steppe village, and if it happened, it would be very soon. Again and again it would appear to them in their night dreams, and they would wake up in the morning with tears in their eyes. A few days after the departure of the peasants, Rombach left the company. He was appointed chief of the medical service of one of the divisions occupying positions on the central section of the Eastern Front. It can be said that the division to which he was appointed was lucky. In his person, it received a man who absorbed all the experience of the war with the Russians. Everyone was very upset, because we had hoped that he would become the chief of the medical service of our own division. Our whole unit lined up along the very village street along which the peasants were travelling on carts only a few days ago. The riders even placed in a parade line 2 cows, which the peasants had given us so that the wounded who required dietary food could receive milk, and 2 bleating rams and a pig. Rombach shook hands with each in farewell. He went around the ranks of his old comrades, even stroking the horses, cows, rams, and pig, at which there was a deafening explosion of laughter. Then, after saying a few parting words, he handed over the command of the company to me. For 3 years, the company carried the invisible flag under his wise and efficient command. Even the tried and tested and hardened in difficulties fighters felt. Finally, Rombach got into the car. I stood on the step and command, "No, to the right." As a farewell, he and I drove along the line, and as soon as we were equal to the last man, I jumped off the step and put my hand to my pilot's cap. As we slowly reached the corner, Rombach disappeared in a cloud of dust behind the acacia plantings. He came back again after 7 years of captivity. The division was forced to redeploy to Kherson. We sent one of the units to Odessa in advance with our most valuable things: medicines, surgical instruments, bandages, coffee, cigarettes. We were simply already learnt by bitter experience during the retreat from the Caucasus. Many commanders did the same thing, and for individual units like ours, this method justified itself. Although, of course, individual units moving unauthorized back and forth in the rear of the front increased the risk of panic, which was already felt there. We heard absolutely incredible stories about Odessa. It was said that hundreds of deserters were hiding in the city. There was a black market where partisans could buy any weapon. The price of a machine gun ranged from 4,000 to 8,000 marks. In the stifling atmosphere of lawlessness and crime that plagued the backyards of all the world's major ports, an infernal carnival of continuous slaughter began. The Jews were blamed for everything. As a result, there were none left in the city. The company loaded onto trains at the station of Vladislavovka. Here, awaiting loading, a huge consignment of winter uniforms from the Air Force warehouse had accumulated. In its quality, it was excellent. The like of it had never been seen in the infantry. My officer on duty, a very fat Air Force officer, came to me, sweating and unhappy, and told me that the stuff was being stolen left and right, and that he and the few men he had left were no longer able to guard the depot. I told him that I agreed to take the goods under my protection and could give him a written receipt for them. He agreed with me. His men started loading the stuff onto our train. About an hour later, a captain from the field gendarmerie arrived. Someone raised the alarm. Herman appeared, a little pale. The captain said that they had received a report that our company was looting. The situation was rather complicated. It was dangerous to contact the captain of the field gendarmerie. I started to put on my overcoat. No, you mustn't put your overcoat on, Herman told me. Why not? So that you can see the ribbons that are attached to your uniform. The captain has the same Saxon medal as you. I owed this situation to His Majesty the King of Saxony, of blessed memory, and to the cleverness of my sergeant major. When two officers are confronted in such a tense situation, before they even look each other in the eye, the first thing they do is to take a quick look at each other's honours. The captain of the field gendarmerie actually had the Saxon Order of Estalbrecht, second class. I received my order in 1917, when I was still a very young officer attached to the headquarters of the regiment of the Royal Saxon Grenadiers, and only for checking the quality of the breakfast, which was particularly to the taste of His Excellency, the Corps commander. I did not ask the captain for what services he had received his order, but I did ask him in which regiment he had served during the First World War, and as a basis for mutual understanding was found, he did not accuse us of looting. We reached a compromise. The company was to unload from the train and pile up on the railway platform all those things which I had accepted for safekeeping and which he said had been stolen. Fortunately, our quartermaster happened to have a delivery note showing the number of fur-lined boots. Though they were not actually counted, there was no particular reason to give them all away, and the captain wasn't going to count the exact number. He just took our word for it, so we kept 100 extra pairs. The next day was one of those false alarms that often happened at that time. A Russian landing on the northern coast of the Crimea was expected any day now, and those loads still lying on the railway platform were doused with petrol and set on fire. This incident had an unexpected sequel a few weeks later. We were sitting on the platform, playing scat and awaiting orders to go to Kherson. However, in the evening the station master came to us. He had received an order that the company was again to unload all its possessions from the train. I went to the telephone to contact division headquarters. At this time, the division was located about 20 kilometers southwest of us in Shik-Ili, a small steppe village northeast of Simferopol. I managed to get in touch with Captain Varnhagen, Major Fabricius's deputy. Varnhagen was a young university lecturer, a specialist in archaeology. Intelligent, skeptical, with a fine sense of falsity, he became a fine officer. In 1940, we were both ordered to collect material for our division's war journal, and he and I had the opportunity to make an exciting journey by car, travelling halfway across France. In Autun, we admired the cathedral with its broad, sun-drenched staircase topped by a vault. The cathedral uniquely combined the light-hearted nonchalance of the local tradition with Gothic piety. Talleyrand, who was Bishop of Autun, never saw the cathedral. It was the only mistake he made in his entire life. We then headed along the Gold Coast, along which the famous wine centres of Burgundy are strung in a chain. In the autumn of 1941, Varnhagen was one of my patients at Point Cossack IT, having been shot in the thigh. He was quite disturbed when I gave him a local anesthetic and left the bullet entry wound open. At this point, I asked him if a mistake had been made and whether we should actually unload all our possessions from the train. No, he replied. The order is correct. But what is the reason? A secret of the highest importance. But this is madness. What will happen to us? At any moment, you'd better stay. But why? Do you remember the time you treated my wound? Of course I remember. I'll meet you in Philippi. And he hung up. Now it was clear what he meant. For some time the Sixth Army had been in retreat. Now apparently the Germans are going to defend the Perikop Isthmus from the opposite side from which they themselves attacked it 2 years ago, and probably on the same line on which it was defended by the Russians. Crimea becomes a cauldron. But unlike many other cauldrons, a fairly large one. The Germans will evacuate it gradually and systematically. They are great masters of this kind of maneuver. They have just demonstrated this in the evacuation of the Taman Peninsula. They were now surrounded on one side by the Black Sea and on the other by the Sea of Azov. The Englishman feels at home on the sea, but to all other Europeans the sea is a hostile element. This is probably the main difference between the English and the peoples living on the continent. Nor are Russians born sailors. De Tocqueville once remarked, "The sea is no friend to the Russians." And what will happen to the Germans? Will they reach the big land safely, or will thousands of them drown at sea? I returned to my company. The men were waiting impatiently for me, wanting to know what the actual order had come from headquarters. Unloading. Cursing everything in the world, swinging their hammers furiously, the riders began to knock the stanchions out from under the wheels of the wagons, by which they were secured to the goods wagons. People had not yet realized that communication with Kherson had been broken, that we might be only one day too late to evacuate to the big land. However, the order we had received may have kept us from falling into the hands of the advanced Russian units somewhere in the Nogai steppe. I decided to go by car to headquarters, as I wanted to find out exactly what had happened. It was beginning to get dark. Getting into an open Volkswagen, we lowered the windscreens for better visibility, although it was very cold. I put a few pairs of fur-lined boots in the car as gifts for the officers of the headquarters. We started on our way. The first stars were shining in the sky. The moon was not due to rise until an hour later. The last glimmers of the sun were fading in the west. I personally drove the car out of the village and then pointed out to the driver in the direction of which star to follow. So we drove along the steppe under a clear night sky. Nothing disturbed the silence. The front line passed far beyond the horizon line. It was obvious that the Sixth Army would not be able to hold the line of defence along the Mayas River, which flowed from the north into the Sea of Azov, and disaster might ensue if the Perikop Isthmus was already threatened. Reached the fury of the gods. It was the Sixth Army that defended Stalingrad. It became a symbol of the biggest defeat we suffered in the course of the war, but with incomprehensible persistence, the dictator assigned the new army the former serial number. We were guided by the stars. Were those stars shining over a foreign land ours? I thought about the cities and countries I had been to in my life. At times the car dived into hollows and then climbed another hill, which rose like a huge black wave against the sky. In my mind, I was transported again to the star-spangled skies over the Caribbean islands, with the light, pleasant breeze blowing and the Negro musicians' spirituals on the half-boat. I remembered the pale stars over the brightly lit Paris. I also remembered that ominous night before the war began, when all the lights went out in Berlin, and only the moon illuminated the deserted streets of the city. There was a strong possibility that I would never see it all again. I felt neither pain nor regret. There was only a slight sadness for the imperfection of our world, in which creative labour is not honoured and people are constantly killing their own kind. The stars no longer twinkled for the individual squads of soldiers who slept a deep sleep in small, widely scattered villages on the steppe. Thousands of them had been sent to certain death. Hundreds of thousands had learnt all the horrors of captivity. With the greatest heroism they fought long and desperately against their own fate. And by a wicked irony, the bravest of them were betrayed in the most shameful manner. But even in the darkest pages of history, there are sometimes small, amusing episodes. At the end of my night journey, I just came across one of them. There was no sense of regret, pain or sorrow in the division headquarters. On the contrary, there was a slightly strange sense of relief. After all the tactical regroupings, There were no troops under the command of the division headquarters at all. For the first time in 4 years of war, there was nothing to be done and no responsibility for the decisions made. For any soldier, such a situation may seem unbearable. How much harder it must have been for the generals. I arrived just in the middle of a raucous feast. The distribution of the fur-lined boots was as enthusiastic as my account of how they had been obtained. Even the military prosecutor gladly squeezed his feet into them. And then we sat round the table, raising mugs with Crimean wine poured into them. The feast dragged on until almost morning. We did not talk about what was ahead of us. Not a single word was said about it. Of the many evenings in my long life that I had spent drinking and talking with my friends, this was one of the most pleasant. We were like shipwrecked men drifting south on an ice floe, trying to warm ourselves in the sunshine.